This story is titled, My Daughter Falsely Accused Me, Leading to My Imprisonment for a Long Time, and now that I have been released, I will repay everything I went through in the same coin. Hey everyone! Before we jump into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed the channel is losing some traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can support us. It's quick, free, and it helps us keep bringing you awesome content. Your support means the world. Let's keep this channel growing together. Thanks so much. Now let's start the video. I don't even know where to start. Writing this makes me so angry, but I need to get it out. My daughter, let's call her Sarah, has been nothing but trouble for years. I don't know if it's how we raised her, or if she's just wired this way, but it feels like she was born to test my patience. She's selfish, ungrateful, and never takes responsibility for anything. It wasn't always this way. When she was little, she was sweet. A bit stubborn, sure, but I thought it was normal kid stuff. But then middle school hit, and everything changed. She started acting like the world owed her something, like she was better than everyone else. She'd throw tantrums if she didn't get her way, slam doors, scream at us, you name it. My wife kept saying, it's just a phase. She'll grow out of it. She didn't. By the time Sarah hit her teenage years, it was like she'd decided to make our lives a living hell. She lied about everything. Where she was, who she was with, what she was doing. If her lips were moving, she was probably lying. She skipped school so much that the principal called us in for a meeting. I told her she needed to shape up, but she just rolled her eyes and said, whatever, Dad. At 16, she dropped out of high school entirely. One day, she came home and announced she wasn't going back. School's stupid, she said. I don't need it. My wife and I begged her to reconsider, but she wasn't hearing it. She packed her things, said she was leaving, and walked out the door without even looking back. She ran off with some boyfriend, a loser who didn't have a job or any prospects. I don't even remember his name. For 3 years, we didn't hear a word from her. No calls, no texts, nothing. My wife was heartbroken. She cried herself to sleep so many nights, wondering if Sarah was okay, if she'd ever come back. Me? I was angry, but I also felt relieved. Without Sarah around, the house was quieter. No drama, no fighting. I thought, maybe this is for the best. Then one night, she showed up on our doorstep. It was pouring rain, and she was standing there soaked to the bone, holding a trash bag full of clothes. I have nowhere else to go, she said. My first instinct was to slam the door in her face, but my wife rushed past me and pulled her inside before I could say a word. She hugged Sarah like she'd just come back from war, even though Sarah hadn't bothered to call us in 3 years. She's our daughter, my wife kept saying. We can't just leave her out there. I let her stay, but I knew it was a mistake. And boy, was I right. At first, I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she'd changed. Maybe she'd finally learned something from her time away. Nope. Within days, she was back to her old ways. She didn't look for a job, didn't help around the house, didn't do anything except sit on the couch scrolling through her phone. We'd ask her to do something simple. Take out the trash, do the dishes, anything. And she'd roll her eyes like we were asking her to move mountains. Why can't you do it? She'd say. I'm tired. Tired from what? Sitting on her ass all day? And then there were the late nights. She'd leave the house after dinner, saying she was going out for a walk, but she'd be gone for hours. Sometimes she wouldn't come home until after midnight. When I asked where she'd been, she'd just shrug and say, nowhere, like it was none of my business. She'd come back smiling, like she didn't have a care in the world, then flop down on the couch and start scrolling through her phone again. I tried to talk to my wife about it, but she kept making excuses. She's been through a lot, she'd say. She just needs time to adjust. Adjust to what? Sitting around all day? Acting like the queen of the house while we bent over backward to accommodate her? One night, I couldn't take it anymore. Sarah had been out until 1 a.m., and when she finally came home, I confronted her. Where the hell have you been? I asked. She just laughed and said, why do you care? That's when I told her she needed to start pulling her weight or find somewhere else to live. Her response? You're supposed to take care of me. That's what parents do. I couldn't believe it. After everything she'd done, dropping out of school, running away, ignoring us for 3 years, she still thought we owed her something. That was the moment I decided I'd had enough. I gave her an ultimatum. She had 24 hours to pack her things and leave. My wife tried to argue, but I shut her down. She's an adult, I said. She made her choices. It's time for her to deal with the consequences. At first, Sarah didn't take me seriously. She just laughed and said, yeah, okay, Dad, like it was some kind of joke. But when she realized I wasn't kidding, her attitude changed. She started yelling. You're a terrible father, she screamed. You don't love me. I stood my ground and gave her my words. She stormed off to her room, slamming the door so hard that the whole house shook. My wife gave me the silent treatment for the rest of the day, but I didn't care. It happened before the 4 hours I gave Sarah to leave were even up. I was in the living room, sitting on the couch and scrolling through the news on my phone, trying to decompress after another argument with my wife about her enabling Sarah. My patience was already worn thin, but I figured I just had to hold out until tomorrow night. Then Sarah would be gone for good, and I could finally have my home back. But life has a funny way of kicking you when you're already down. There was a loud knock at the door. 3 quick, sharp bangs that sent my heart racing. It wasn't a friendly knock. I got up to answer it, my stomach twisting into knots. When I opened the door, there were 3 police officers standing there, all of them looking dead serious. "Sir, we have a warrant to search your property," one of them said. My mind went blank for a second. "What? Why?" "We received an anonymous tip about illegal drugs being stored in this house," the officer explained. "The report is filed under your name, my house." I felt like the ground had just been pulled out from under me. I wanted to argue, to slam the door in their faces, but I knew that wouldn't get me anywhere. So I stepped aside and let them in, feeling a sense of dread settle over me like a heavy blanket. They spread out quickly, one officer staying in the living room while the others began searching the house. My wife stood frozen in the hallway, her face pale as a ghost. Sarah, on the other hand, sat on the couch, completely unfazed. She even had the nerve to smirk at me as the officers went upstairs to check the bedrooms. I knew. I didn't have proof, but I knew this was her doing. Who else could it be? She'd been sneaking around, staying out late, hanging with God knows who. She was the only one who had anything to gain from this chaos. The officers searched her room first. I stood in the hallway, watching as they tore through her things, flipping through her drawers, pulling the sheets off her bed, emptying out her backpack. But they didn't find anything. Not a single thing. I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was all a misunderstanding. Maybe Sarah hadn't done anything after all. Then they moved on to my room. I didn't think they'd find anything there. Why would they? I wasn't involved in anything illegal, and I certainly didn't have drugs in my house. But then one of the officers pulled back the mattress on my bed and stopped. "Here," he said, holding up a bag filled with what I immediately recognized as heroin. As the officer held up the first bag of heroin, I glanced at Sarah, hoping to see shock or confusion on her face. Instead, she smirked, her lips curling into a look that sent a chill down my spine. She didn't flinch, didn't deny anything. She just sat there like this was all a game to her. My blood boiled as I realized she wasn't just indifferent. She was proud of what she'd done. I couldn't breathe. It felt like the walls were closing in on me. "That's not mine," I said automatically, my voice shaking. But the officers weren't listening. They kept searching, and by the time they were done, they'd found several more bags hidden under my bed and across the room. "Sir, you're under arrest for possession of a controlled substance," one of them said as they pulled out the handcuffs. My wife burst into tears. Sarah just sat there, watching the whole thing like it was a movie. When they cuffed me and led me out the door, I looked back at her one last time, hoping to see some kind of guilt or remorse on her face. Instead, she smiled. Smiled. The next few hours were a blur. They took me down to the station, fingerprinted me, took my mugshot. I kept saying over and over that the drugs weren't mine, that someone had set me up, but no one cared. The evidence was in my house, under my bed. That was enough for them. They denied me bail, saying the amount of heroin they found suggested I was involved in distribution. My lawyer tried to fight it, but it didn't matter. I was stuck in jail, waiting for the investigation to play out. Over the next few weeks, they started looking into the case. They tested the drugs for fingerprints, checked for DNA, anything that could link them to me. But there was nothing. My fingerprints weren't on the bags, and there was no evidence tying me to the drugs. Still, that didn't mean I was off the hook. The house was in my name, which meant the drugs were my responsibility, unless I could prove otherwise. My lawyer argued that someone else must have planted them there, but without solid evidence, it was my word against theirs. I knew it was Sarah. I didn't know how she'd done it, but I knew it was her. Maybe she'd been storing the drugs in my room without me noticing, or maybe she'd planted them there as a way to get back at me for kicking her out. Either way, she was the only one who could have done it. I spent 5 agonizing months in jail while the case dragged on. Not because the investigation was complicated, or because there wasn't enough evidence to clear my name, but simply because the court's schedule was backlogged. Apparently, justice had to wait its turn, even when someone's life was being torn apart. The delay felt like an eternity. Every day in that cell was another day I sat with my thoughts, replaying everything over and over. The betrayal, the humiliation, the helplessness. It all circled in my head like a broken record. My body was locked up, but my mind never stopped pacing. I couldn't stop thinking about how my own daughter had done this to me. I wondered if she was laughing about it, going about her life like nothing had happened, while I was stuck in a place I didn't belong. My wife visited me a few times during those months, but even her presence felt like another weight on my chest. She wasn't there to offer support or reassurance, not really. Every time she came, it felt like she was probing, fishing for answers I couldn't give her. I needed her to believe in me, to fight for me, but instead, she just seemed confused, unsure if she could trust the man she'd been married to for 20 years. Why would Sarah do something like this? She asked during one visit, her voice hesitant, like she couldn't even say the words out loud without doubting herself. I clenched my fist so tightly my knuckles turned white. You know why, I said, trying to keep my voice calm but failing. You've seen what she's like. You've seen her lie, manipulate, twist things to get what she wants. This isn't new. She shook her head, her face pale and drawn. But planting drugs? Getting you arrested? That's not just lying. I don't know. It's evil. Her voice cracked, and she looked down at her hands, wringing them like they held the answers. She's been on this path for years, I said bitterly. You just didn't want to see it. You kept making excuses for her. She's been through a lot. Every time she crossed the line, you let her get away with it, and now this is where we are. My words hit her like a slap, but I didn't care. I was too angry, too tired, too broken to soften the truth for her. If she had stood by me, believed in me from the start, maybe I could have handled this better. But instead, she kept second-guessing me, making me feel like I was the one on trial. Maybe you just didn't know what was happening, she said during another visit, her voice trembling. Maybe there's more to this. I stared at her, stunned by how little faith she had in me. Do you even hear yourself? I snapped. You're my wife. You've known me for 2 decades. Do you really think I'd get involved in drugs? Do you really think I'd risk everything for… What? Some heroin under my bed? She didn't answer. She just sat there, looking at the floor like a scolded child. But her silence spoke volumes. She didn't believe me. Not completely. She might have wanted to, but deep down, she had doubts. And that doubt cut deeper than anything else. The worst part was knowing that Sarah had planned this. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment decision. This was calculated. She'd taken the time to hide the drugs in my room, knowing it would shift the blame onto me. She'd reported me anonymously, making sure the police had a reason to show up with a warrant. She'd done everything she could to frame me, and it had worked. And yet, my own wife couldn't see it. My parents, who visited once, couldn't see it. Even some of my so-called friends started to distance themselves, whispering behind my back. The evidence might not have pointed to me directly, but the stigma of being arrested for drugs was enough to make people doubt. And doubt is a powerful thing. It sticks to you like a stain you can't wash off. While the court delayed my hearing again and again, I had nothing to do but sit in that cell and stew in my anger. I thought about all the times Sarah had lied to my face, all the times I'd given her chances she didn't deserve. I thought about the way she'd smirked when the police took me away, like she knew exactly what she was doing. I thought about my wife's tears, not because I was in jail, but because she didn't know if she could trust me anymore. By the time I finally got my day in court, I wasn't the same person who had walked into that jail 5 months earlier. I was harder, angrier, and less willing to forgive. The system had failed me. My family had failed me. And all because of the selfish actions of one person, my own daughter. When the evidence finally came to light, Sarah's texts, the witnesses who saw her sneaking around, the lack of fingerprints or DNA tying me to the drugs, it was like the world suddenly remembered I existed. The charges against me were dropped, but the damage was already done. 5 months of my life were gone. 5 months where I was treated like a criminal, doubted by the people I thought loved me. My name might have been cleared legally, but socially, emotionally, I knew I'd never be the same. I wasn't just angry at Sarah. I was angry at everyone who doubted me, who'd left me to rot in that cell while they questioned whether I was the kind of man who would hide heroin under his bed. And in that anger, a seed of revenge started to grow. I didn't just want Sarah to face the consequences of her actions. I wanted her to know what it felt like to lose everything, to have the world look at her the way it had looked at me. I wanted her to pay. The first thing I did when I got home was sit in the living room in silence. My wife was there, standing awkwardly by the doorway like she didn't know what to say. Maybe she thought I'd be thrilled to be back, or maybe she expected me to forgive everything and move on. But I couldn't even look at her without feeling a mix of betrayal and anger. Why didn't you believe me? I finally asked, breaking the silence. My voice cracked a little, which pissed me off even more. I wanted to sound strong, not broken. She didn't answer right away. She just stood there, wringing her hands. It was hard, okay? The drugs were found in your room. What was I supposed to think? You were supposed to know me, I snapped. You've known me for 20 years. You've seen what Sarah's like. But the second something bad happens, you turn on me? My voice was rising now, and I didn't care. You know I didn't do it. Deep down, you knew. But instead of standing by me, you let me rot in jail while you played mom to the person who actually did this. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I wasn't about to feel sorry for her. She wasn't the one who'd spent months in a cell, treated like a criminal. I'm sorry, she whispered, but it didn't mean anything to me. Sorry didn't give me back the months I lost. Sorry didn't erase the fact that she doubted me when I needed her most. Over the next few days, I tried to piece my life back together. The investigation had finally turned up undeniable proof that Sarah was behind everything. The text messages on her phone showed that she'd been dealing drugs for months, maybe longer. She'd been using our house as a stash spot, hiding the heroin under my bed so that if anything went wrong, I'd take the fall. The texts were damning. They showed her coordinating with a dealer, talking about moving product, and even laughing about how Dad would never notice. I read every single one of them, my hands shaking with rage. How could my own daughter do this to me? What kind of person sets up their own father to save themselves? The police also found witnesses who came forward, saying they'd seen Sarah sneaking around late at night, meeting with sketchy people in parking lots and alleyways. One of her so-called friends admitted that Sarah had bragged about hiding drugs in my house because she thought it was the perfect cover. When the police finally issued a warrant for her arrest, I felt a mix of relief and bitterness. Relief that they were finally going after the real culprit, but bitterness that it had taken so long, and that I'd had to pay the price for her actions. Sarah was arrested a few days after I got home. They found her staying at some rundown apartment with a bunch of lowlifes. When the police searched the place, they found more drugs, along with scales, baggies, and cash. It was clear she wasn't just using, she was fully involved in the drug trade. I thought seeing her arrested would bring me some kind of closure, but it didn't. If anything, it just made me angrier. She didn't look scared or ashamed when they took her away. She looked annoyed, like this was just some inconvenience she'd have to deal with. My wife was devastated when she heard about the arrest. She's still our daughter, she kept saying over and over, like a broken record. She's made mistakes, but she's still our baby. I couldn't take it anymore. She's not my daughter, I snapped. Not anymore. My daughter wouldn't do this to me. My daughter wouldn't destroy her own family just to save her own skin. The legal process that followed was long, exhausting, and messy. Much like everything else Sarah had left in her wake. She was charged with possession of drugs, intent to distribute, and perhaps most painfully for me, false accusations against her own father. That charge hit me like a gut punch every time I heard it spoken aloud in court, knowing that she had deliberately orchestrated my arrest, gone out of her way to frame me and watch me suffer, made my blood boil. The evidence against her was overwhelming. The text between her and her dealer, the witness statements, and even her own carelessness when stashing drugs in her apartment painted a damning picture. But as damning as it was, it didn't make things easier for me. Every court hearing, every delay, every smug look she gave when she was brought in for questioning, it all chipped away at whatever pieces of humanity I still clung to. As part of the investigation, Sarah was required to take a drug test. Unsurprisingly, it came back positive, not just for heroin, but for several other substances, including cocaine and amphetamines. It was the final nail in the coffin. The daughter I had once rocked to sleep as a baby, the little girl I had taught to ride a bike, wasn't just a liar and a manipulator, she was an addict and a criminal. Seeing the results didn't shock me, but it hurt. It was one thing to know in your gut that your child is on a destructive path. It's another thing entirely to see it spelled out in black and white. Part of me wanted to feel pity for her, to see her as the victim of her own choices. But that part of me was drowned out by anger. She hadn't just ruined her life. She had tried to ruin mine. My lawyer told me I didn't have to attend every hearing, but I couldn't stay away. I needed to see her face, needed her to know that I wasn't going to let her get away with this without seeing the damage she caused. At one point during the trial, her lawyer argued that Sarah's actions were the result of addiction, that she was not in her right mind when she reported me to the police. I couldn't stay silent, not about this. As I sat there, I knew this wasn't some desperate mistake driven by addiction. It wasn't about weakness or bad judgment. It was intentional. She had never been a family person, never cared about anyone but herself. This wasn't about drugs. It was about revenge. She wanted to hurt me and put me in trouble for kicking her out. That much was clear. But I kept those thoughts to myself, knowing that the truth was already laid bare for everyone to see. There was no need for me to speak. Her actions spoke louder than anything I could say. The trial dragged on for months, delayed repeatedly by procedural nonsense and Sarah's lawyer trying to reduce her charges. Meanwhile, I tried to rebuild the wreckage of my life. People in the neighborhood still whispered when I walked by, some still unsure whether I was truly innocent despite the evidence. My wife seemed to exist in a constant state of denial. "She's sick," she kept saying, like it was a mantra that would make all of this easier to swallow. She didn't mean it. She didn't mean it? I snapped one night after dinner. She knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't just using, she was dealing. She put my name on a report to the police. How the hell do you not mean that? We're her parents, no matter what. Zrania, her voice trembling. Not anymore, I said coldly, pushing back my chair and leaving the table. When the verdict finally came, it felt more like a formality than a victory. Sarah was found guilty on all charges: possession of narcotics, intent to distribute, and filing false accusations. The judge didn't hold back. However, instead of prison, she was sentenced to serve 8 years in a long-term drug rehabilitation center. The judge believed that addressing her addiction was critical to ensuring she didn't repeat her actions. She showed little emotion as the sentence was read, only giving a slight shrug as if to say, "It is what it is." I wanted to feel relief, but I didn't. The damage was already done. 8 years wouldn't erase the 5 months I spent in a cell. It wouldn't fix the relationships that had been shattered or undo the stain on my reputation. If anything, her conviction felt like the closing chapter of a book I wished I'd never started reading. After the trial, I got a restraining order against Sarah to make sure she could never come near me again. Even when she eventually gets out, I don't want her anywhere near my life. She made her choices, and I made mine. For a while, I couldn't sleep. I kept waking up in the middle of the night, haunted by everything that had happened. My wife, on the other hand, seemed stuck in the past. She started writing Sarah letters in prison, trying to keep some sort of relationship alive. At first, I didn't say anything, but eventually, it became too much. "What are you hoping to accomplish?" I asked her one night, when I caught her sealing another envelope. "She's our daughter," she said again. That same broken mantra that had driven me up the wall for months. "She stopped being our daughter the day she put me in cuffs," I replied, my voice cold and sharp. "I don't care what she's going through. I don't care if she gets better. She's out of my life, and that's not changing." That conversation was the tipping point. We were no longer on the same page, no longer even in the same book. My wife clung to the idea of Sarah as the daughter we used to know, the little girl she'd raised, the baby she once held. But that version of Sarah didn't exist anymore. Not to me, and maybe not to anyone. It became clear that our marriage wasn't going to survive this. The trust between us was gone, eroded by months of doubt, anger, and pain. My wife had doubted me when I needed her most, and now she was trying to hold on to a relationship with the person who had destroyed everything we'd built. How could we come back from that? The answer was simple. We couldn't. One night, after another tense argument about Sarah, I finally said it out loud. "I don't think we can keep doing this." My wife looked at me, her eyes filled with tears. "You're saying you want to leave?" "I'm saying this isn't working," I said, my voice steady but heavy. "We're not the same people we were before all of this. I don't trust you, and you don't understand me anymore. And honestly, I don't think I can stay in this house, surrounded by everything that reminds me of her." She nodded slowly, wiping her tears. "I don't want this, but I understand." We agreed to separate a few weeks later. She kept the house, the one place I didn't want to be anymore. I moved into a small apartment across town, far enough to feel like I was starting fresh, but close enough to handle the practicalities of dividing our lives. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. The worst part wasn't the physical separation. It was the realization that the life we'd built together had crumbled so completely. We'd spent 2 decades as partners, raising a family, building a home, only for it to fall apart in the wake of our daughter's actions. Sarah's choices hadn't just destroyed my trust in her. They'd destroyed my marriage. The worst part of all this wasn't the jail time or the trial. It was the realization that the life I thought I had was never as strong as I believed. My marriage had been hanging by a thread, and I hadn't even realized it until it was too late. Maybe someday I'll find a way to let go of all this anger. But not today. Today, I just focus on putting one foot in front of the other and keeping Sarah as far away from me as possible. She made her choices, and she'll live with the consequences. But so will I.